In the pre-dawn hours of June 6, 1944, 13,000 American paratroopers flew toward the northern coast of France, the lead element in the Allied offensive to finally take Bastogne, Europa. Among these bravest of men were the 150 or so soldiers and officers that formed Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division. Led, of course, by 1st Lieutenant Thomas Meehan. Sadly, Lieutenant Meehan never got the chance to fight in Normandy. His plane was shot down before he or anyone with him could bail out. I think about that a lot whenever I watch Band of Brothers, a story largely told through the eyes of then First Lieutenant Richard Winters, Easy Company's executive officer. Winters, as second in command, was part of the headquarters platoon that all perished before their feet even touched French soil. He could have easily been in that plane, or his plane could have just as easily been the one to take a fatal hit. And then, well, who knows what would have happened? I'm not saying the European war as a whole would have changed course, but it certainly would have had an impact. At the very least, it would have deprived us of one of the greatest examples of leadership from the 20th century.
We're not lost, Private. We're in Normandy.
But rather than dwell on the tragedy that could have been, let us appreciate the life that was lived. Indeed, 80 years later, we are still celebrating these brave men. Recently, I came across an article on French children celebrating D-Day veterans as heroes as they arrived in Normandy for the celebration. With all the division in our world today, it's great to hear that the courage and sacrifice by these veterans has not been forgotten, and that the next generation in France proudly honored their arrival. I found this article thanks to Ground News, this video's sponsor. You can check them out at ground.news/mastersamwise. Ground News is a website and app that collects and analyzes headlines and stories from both sides of the political aisle, enabling you to get a fuller picture of world events. Using the bias comparison feature, we can see how the right-wing sources emphasize the heroism of the veterans, and the left-wing outlets report more on a particular veteran's modesty. We can also review the bias distribution and ownership charts, which tell us what percentage of the 87 reporting outlets are from left, right, and center, and if any of them are owned by independent organizations. My favorite feature of Ground News, though, has got to be the blind spot feed, which shows you stories largely ignored by one side of the political spectrum. Ground News surfaces around 20 such stories every single day, helping you be aware of all sides of any given issue. We all know people who get their news from one source. Ground News can help break your family, your friends, and you out from that echo chamber. Go to ground.news/mastersamwise to give it a try. If you sign up through my link, you get 40% off the Vantage plan, which is what I use to get unlimited access to all the features. Ground News has changed how I read the news and has made reading the news far easier and more enjoyable. It's helped me understand what's going on around the world and has given me a variety of viewpoints to consider, something that modern news struggles with. If you're looking for a news platform that actually shows you the full story, then Ground News is for you. I hope you'll check them out and take advantage of this amazing offer. And thank you again to Ground News for sponsoring this video. I've talked a lot on this channel about various examples of outstanding virtuous masculinity, about men who demonstrate the heights of bravery, loyalty, perseverance, humility, and self-giving love. And while all those men are worth learning from and even imitating, they all share one flaw. They aren't real. I don't say that so much to diminish the power of fiction as I do to elevate the impact that real stories should have on us. It's one thing, a good thing, mind you, to write a character who can serve as a role model, but it is far easier to imagine an ideal than it is to live that ideal. So when we watch or read about a man like Major Winters, his example should make a stronger impression on us. So what exactly was that example? Well, one might say that Major Winters was a paragon of leadership, which begs the question, what does it mean to be a leader? In response, I will simply quote Winters' own war memoirs. Don't waste time attempting to define leadership. No need to go to the dictionary. The infantry school at Fort Benning, Georgia, has defined leadership in just 2 words via its motto, follow me.
Let's go! Let's go! Follow me!
I could probably end the video right here. That's it, that's all you need to know to be a great leader. But Winters did write a whole book on the subject, and he concluded with 10 principles on how to succeed as a leader. Principle 2. Lead from the front. Say, follow me, and then lead the way. Naturally, leading from the front, leading by example, is absolutely essential for strong leadership. Never ask your team to do something you wouldn't do yourself. That quote is not saying that a leader has to be able to do all that his subordinates can do. A platoon leader or company commander or the manager of any team of diverse talents naturally cannot fill in for any and every member of the team under him. That's just not how things work. Easy Company consisted of riflemen, machine gunners, mortarmen, radio operators, and so forth. Its officers were not expected to be able to wield those weapons and tools with the same proficiency as the soldiers who worked with them daily, but rather were required to ensure that Easy Company remained an effective fighting force no matter how many or how few of those men and pieces of equipment they had on hand. Winters is simply emphasizing that a leader must not put his own well-being ahead of those of his men.
Never put yourself in a position where you can take from these men.
If he is ordering those men to sprint across an open field and assault an enemy in a fortified position, he had better be willing to charge with them. Winters demonstrates this forcefully on at least 2 occasions. In the assault on Carentan on D-Day +6, the company is pinned down by a machine gun, and their newly minted commanding officer is the only one still up and moving, encouraging, to put it mildly, his men to break cover and continue the attack. Standing in the middle of the column on the right-hand side of the road, I hollered, "Move out! Move out!" This did no good. Everyone had his head down. This was the one and only time in the war that I really blew my top and physically kicked ass. I came out of that ditch with only my M1 in hand and hollering. I ran to the head of the column, kicked ass on the left side of the road, then ran to the right side of the road, back and forth, screaming at the top of my voice, "Get going!" I will never forget the surprise and fear on those faces looking up at me. With me running around on the road like a wild man, the German machine guns seemed to zero in on me. I was a wide open target. I don't think the deeds of men get much more impressive than running out in the open in the face of enemy fire, urging your men into the fray, not even bothering to shoot back because it would distract from the objective. Although I suppose you could make the argument that a single platoon of paratroopers forcing the retreat of 2 full companies of enemy soldiers is up there. I am, of course, referring to the firefight depicted in the Band of Brothers episode Crossroads, in which Winters leads a charge once again, and thanks to his leadership, Easy Company turns a potential disaster into a resounding victory by routing a German force that outnumbered them at least 5-1. In the miniseries, Winters orders his men to wait for a red smoke grenade to go off, but according to his own memoirs, he simply outran every member of this elite platoon of paratroopers, to the point that he was, as shown in the miniseries, totally alone when he reached the roadway and encountered the German sentry there. There are 2 key elements here of this scene that I want to consider. First, Winters' exceptional physical fitness. Strength and athleticism are important qualities for just about any man, any person to hone, but obviously they are of paramount importance for a soldier in the field. Winters took his physical fitness incredibly seriously. While he couldn't outperform his men, nor should he have been able to, in their given combat specialities, he could provide an example of how a soldier should take care of his body in order to perform whatever duties he was called to. Physical fitness is another prerequisite for success. I freely admit that I was blessed with a sound physical constitution, but whenever possible, I took opportunity to improve my physical stamina. While men washed out on a daily basis, the contingent from Easy Company that completed the training and earned their wings at Fort Benning were tough as nails. Because I was in such good shape, my fatigue level never reached the point of physical exhaustion that contributes to mental exhaustion and ultimately to combat fatigue. We all experience sleep deprivation at times, that is the nature of stress, but a physically exhausted leader routinely makes poor decisions in times of crisis. Principle 3. Stay in top physical shape. Physical stamina is the root of mental toughness. His words here get at a fundamental truth of human existence. We don't just have bodies, we are bodies. We are not just brains driving around meat-powered skeletons. Everything we do with our bodies and everything we put into them affects us, affects our ability to communicate effectively, to handle adverse conditions and emotions, and of course, as Winters says, to make decisions. And really, that's what a leader is, one who is entrusted to make decisions, to make the right decisions. Band of Brothers highlights how Winters' predecessor and one of his successors failed where he so consistently succeeded in that regard. Sobel regularly made poor decisions in the field while the men were running combat scenarios. He was jittery, panicky, and he had no tactical sense.
They're right out there somewhere. Let's just get them.
Lieutenant Dyke completely froze up during the attack on Foy, and then when he finally did get moving, he tried to send his men on an inevitably ill-fated flanking route instead of following his orders to go straight into town. I want to pause here and note that the miniseries, Stephen Ambrose's book of the same name, and even Winter's own memoirs are said to be somewhat inaccurate when it comes to Lieutenant Dyke's portrayal. The man received 2 Bronze Stars for bravery, including one for his actions during the defense of Bastogne. While he certainly did freeze up during the subsequent attack on Foy, records indicate that that was at least partly due to him being wounded during the charge across the open field. So take whatever is said here about the real man with a grain of salt. I'm not a historian, and even if I was, they are clearly not infallible. Neither, of course, was Winters himself. And to be fair, Winters had his own failures of decision-making, as he himself writes. My principal error had been a tendency to fall into a particular habit. Although I did not realize it at the time, I tended to develop a routine when attacking the enemy. I usually deployed 1st platoon on the left, 2nd platoon on the right, and 3rd platoon in reserve. I continued this method of deployment throughout the war. As you might expect, the first 2 platoons incurred the greatest number of casualties, which is why 60 years after the war, the survivors of 3rd platoon far outnumber their sister platoons. This bothers me a lot. Principle 8. Take a moment of self-reflection. Look at yourself in the mirror every night and ask yourself if you did your best. How many of us would be far better men and women if we just did this? If we looked at ourselves honestly, examined where we had failed, and vowed to be better tomorrow? But nonetheless, there can be no denying the fact that Winters was an extremely effective combat leader. We'll return to the crossroads again, not for the last time, to talk about his crucial decision there. Determining that we could not stay where we were, but refusing to retreat, I decided to attack. To surrender the initiative to the enemy was indefensible. I figured that when you're in a face-off, the guy who gets off the first shot usually wins. There was really no other decision to make other than to take the battle directly to the enemy. I asked God to give me strength. The German troops ahead of them were in a position such that, should they advance, they could have struck directly at 2nd Battalion's headquarters. Winters could not stomach the thought of retreating and saving his own men at the cost of a potentially devastating attack should the Germans realize just how vulnerable the American line was.
They can outflank us along the dike and catch us out here as soon as they figure that out.
So, he seized the initiative. As he puts it, there was no other decision, but that is only because he had carefully examined the situation and thought through the various possible outcomes. Instead of prioritizing his own safety or even that of his platoon, Winters was aware of the strategic importance of this engagement. His decision to attack instead of staying put was not at all like Sobel's jumpy, ill-advised order in the English woods.
Captain, you've just been killed, along with 95% of your company.
But rather it was the result of careful consideration and planning. Principle 6. Anticipate problems and prepare to overcome obstacles. Don't wait until you get to the top of the ridge and then make up your mind. When Captain Winters leapt alone onto the top of that roadway in Holland, he did not blanch at the sight of an entire German company spread out before him. He had already made up his mind that he was attacking, and so he did. The movements of the enemy seemed surreal to me. When they rose up, their reaction seemed to be so slow. When they turned to look over their shoulders at the sound of my firing, it was in slow motion. And when they started to raise their rifles to fire, they seemed so lethargic. I cannot give you a reason for this mental trance that I was in other than to say that everybody around me seemed out of synchronization. I was the only one who seemed normal. Doubtless, the German troops were utterly confused and shocked that they were under direct fire. They hadn't planned for this, and thus they weren't prepared for it. But Winters had, and thus Winters was. But not just Winters, of course. The rest of his platoon was close behind, despite his speed, and soon found themselves with what Winters described as a duck shoot. Without effective leadership to calm them down and to make this battle organized chaos, the enemy's retreat disintegrated into a rout. I can hardly think of a better example of how necessary and impactful good leadership is than this scene right here. Captain Winters did everything right. He scouted the terrain, assessed the situation carefully, came up with a decisive plan, and then carried it out forcefully, leading from the front. The German officers? We'll never know exactly what they did, but at the very least, they let their men be cowed by a much smaller force with a single machine gun providing covering fire, then failed to organize anything resembling an effective resistance when they came under direct attack. They were passive, inactive, indecisive, whereas Winters understood the value of initiative and momentum. It helps, of course, that Easy Company was quite simply one of the best rifle companies in the world at that time. In terms of teamwork and marksmanship, it is believed that they had few equals in either the German or American armies. Principle 4. Develop your team. If you know your people and are fair in setting realistic goals and expectations and lead by example, you will develop teamwork. Winters knew his men exceptionally well. Having been with them since basic training at Toccoa, he certainly was well aware of every man's strengths, weaknesses, and abilities in the field.
Lieutenant Sobel does not hate Easy Company, Private Random. He just hates you.
And for those men who joined as replacements, Winters knew they needed to be able to adapt to the shock of battle, hence his decision to train them with live ammo scavenged from the Normandy campaign, a choice that, according to his own records, paid dividends during subsequent battles. To instill fire discipline and to prepare the replacements for combat, I conducted company live fire field problems. It was dangerous business that scared the replacements and veterans alike. Had anyone been hurt, it would have been my neck. But the training paid huge dividends, and fortunately, we did not suffer any casualties as we prepared for the next operation. Later on, during the Holland and Bastogne campaigns, time after time, Easy Company maneuvered under fire very effectively. However, it would not be fair for me to talk about the training of Easy Company without mentioning Captain Sobel.
Your weekend pass is revoked.
As badly as everyone in Easy Company hated the man's guts, and although it certainly would have been an unmitigated disaster should he have been allowed to lead them into combat,
I will not follow that man into combat.
there can be no doubt that his tyrannical rule, as Winters puts it, played no small role in making the men of Easy Company into the paratroopers that would win multiple crucial battles throughout the course of the war.
This is Easy Company. And under my command, this will be the first and finest company in this regiment.
Despite his personal shortcomings, Sobel drove each member of the company to become an elite soldier capable of taking the war to Hitler's Germany. In that sense, Herbert Maxwell Sobel made Easy Company by producing a combat company that acted with a single-minded purpose. Sobel drove us hard, and he continued driving us when other companies had already fallen out and gone to the showers. While the other commands within the 506th were getting hot showers and the early food, we were still out there, working, taking an additional lap around the track, and standing at attention to see if anybody was moving. In other words, Captain Sobel was a fantastic trainer of soldiers, but had been put in the wrong position as a leader of them.
Now, they must have put him in charge for a reason.
Yeah, because the Army wouldn't make a mistake, right, Shift?
It makes me wonder whether another leader could have succeeded where Sobel failed, while simultaneously imitating his success in training the men. Could Winters have pushed the men to those exceptional lengths and still earned their respect and trust? Perhaps, especially considering the fact that he was quite competent in the field, and that he held himself to the same high or higher standards of physical fitness that were required for the men, while the men of Easy Company doubted Sobel's ability to do a mere 30 push-ups. Regardless, it is clear that Sobel's methods were effective in producing the finest of soldiers as he so desired.
The first and finest company in this regiment.
Stephen Ambrose recounts that when asked if Easy Company succeeded because of or despite Sobel's influence, those paratroopers who did not respond because of answered both. Why do I say all this? Well, for one thing, I'm trying to be somewhat historically accurate in my commentary, and I don't want to give off the impression that I think Winters should receive all the credit for Easy Company's overwhelming competence in the field. The man himself would certainly not want anyone to think so. Principle 7. Remain humble. Don't worry about who receives the credit. Never let power or authority go to your head. Returning once again to the crossroads, that episode tells the story of the battle through the words of Captain Winters' after-action report. There was no superior officer or staff officer present to witness any part of the engagement. Therefore, it was up to me to write the account. Describing this action, I intentionally wrote the entire narrative without once using the word I. My reason was simple. I wanted to ensure that all credit went to the men who deserved it.
Try writing in the first person plural, Say we a lot.
Thanks for the tip.
When Winter says don't worry about who receives the credit, I take that to mean don't you worry about you getting enough credit. We should never do what is right because we believe it will bring us glory and the laudations of others. We should also never do anything wrong for the sake of glory, just to be clear. Someone has to do what is right because it is right. Humility is not about thinking or speaking poorly of oneself, but rather about thinking of others first. And that is quite simply what a good leader does. A leader exists for the sake of those whom he leads, not the other way around.
Never put yourself in a position where you can take from these men.
He is there to ensure their success, safety, and well-being. He is called to sacrifice his own, if need be, for the sake of his men, because it's not about him, it's about them.
Let him have it, boy!
My real satisfaction lay in the eyes of the men. These men were, after all, the ones who got the job done. Principle 5. Delegate responsibility to your subordinates and let them do their jobs. You can't do a good job if you don't have a chance to use your imagination or creativity. And Principle 9. True satisfaction comes from getting the job done. The key to a successful leader is to earn respect, not because of rank or position, but because you are a leader of character. Throughout his tenure as Easy Company's leader, from June to October of 1944, Lieutenant, later Captain Winters, lived these principles to the fullest. For one of the best examples of Principle 5, we would have to harken back to D-Day, when Easy Company was asked to destroy the German battery at Breakhor Manor. If you couldn't believe I'd gone this long in a Band of Brothers video without mentioning Breakhor, well, neither can I. Unsurprisingly, Easy Company's successful attack at Breakhor shares many similarities with their victory at the Dutch Crossroads. I guess I should say that the Crossroads imitates Breakhor, which did after all come first. Winters scouted the terrain, determined where to place his machine guns, where the 2 assault units should attack from, and then personally led the assault down the trenches. But he didn't micromanage every aspect. Winters writes in his memoirs that Compton also sent Sergeants Lipton and Ranney to a concealed position to put flanking fire on the enemy, while my detachment crawled across the open field to approach the first gun. In no way does he indicate that Compton's decision was anything other than the man's own creativity and ingenuity. Winters trusted his platoon leader to effectively assess the combat scenario through his own eyes, and deploy his men where they'd be the most effective. That demonstrates the rare form of trust shared by men who have endured hardships together and who have come to rely on one another's instincts and decision-making. As for Principle 9, we already touched on it a few minutes ago, as Winters wrote his report on the action at the Crossroads.
Say we a lot.
But just for the sake of showing consistency living out this ideal, let's listen to his words as he reflected on the assault at Breakhor Manor. Killing did not make me happy, but in this particular circumstance, it left me momentarily satisfied. Satisfied because it led to a confidence in getting a difficult job done with minimal casualties. For the time being, I was just happy to have survived my baptism by fire. I had always been confident in my own abilities, but the success at Breakhor increased my confidence in my leadership, as well as my ability to pass it on to my soldiers. Earlier, we touched on Winters' humility, and here we read of his self-confidence. Those two traits are often set at odds with each other, and to be quite frank, that is ridiculous. Humility requires accurate self-knowledge. In order to help others, we must first know what we are capable of. We must know how we can help. There would be no sense in Winters thinking that he was a poor leader when he knew for a fact he was an effective one. He was placed in a role as the newly minted commanding officer of Easy Company, where he would be leading and teaching other leaders. Thinking himself anything less than a good leader, albeit one with room to grow, would be quite unhelpful. You can't teach people what you yourself do not know. Winters saw his focus on getting the job done, not on chasing medals or accolades, as one of the aspects that made him a great leader. And of course, it was. That is what a leader is supposed to be. Someone who is entrusted with making the right decisions in order to carry out a given directive. All too often, however, those entrusted with positions of authority use it to advance their own selfish interests. They seek glory and praise, they hoard wealth, they chase an ever-increasing level of power. For such people, those whom they lead exist for the sake of their boss, rather than the other way around. Major Winters could hardly be more opposed to such a mindset. You may notice that was one of the first times I referred to him as Major Winters in this video. That would be because we are now moving on to his departure from Easy Company and promotion to battalion staff. If there's a moment that perfectly illustrates Winters' lack of personal career ambition, it ironically would be this very promotion. As excited as I was about the new responsibility, my transfer was bittersweet, since it entailed leaving Easy Company. Orders were orders, there was no room for looking at it any other way. But I would be less than truthful if I said that the day I left Easy Company was not a tough day. I was now simply the battalion executive officer, a staff officer with no command authority. I was no longer creative. I felt that I had lost my men.
Speed is the key.
Keep moving and lead the way. Dick, Easy's in good hands.
It takes an incredible man to handle such a grave disappointment, losing the men whom he knew and trusted, and who knew and trusted him, and still carrying on, knowing that someone had to fill this role, so if he was going to do it, he'd make damn sure he'd do it to the best of his abilities. On the cover of his book,
Finish your novel yet?
Winters identifies himself, despite having later commanded an entire battalion, as commander, Easy Company, 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment. If that doesn't tell you everything you need to know about his bond with those men and how difficult it must have been to be torn away from that command, I don't know what will. And yet, as mentioned, he would not sulk or languor in his new role, despite the fact that I found life on battalion staff extremely boring in contrast to commanding Easy Company.
And I thought executive officer was supposed to be a fun job.
It's no small wonder, then, that Winters, after several months of life as battalion executive officer, very nearly took the first chance he could to resume command of Easy Company. In the attack on Foy, where Easy's new commander, Lieutenant Norman Dyke, had lost his nerve and called his men to a halt under withering enemy fire, Winters began to charge in. The company was like a bunch of sitting ducks out there in the snow. Colonel Sink, who was observing the attack, turned and hollered, "What are you going to do, Winters?" "I'm going," I yelled, and I grabbed my M1 and moved out to take command of Easy Company in order to get them moving again. I had only taken a few steps when I decided that my job was to lead the battalion, not a company. I turned around and walked back, and there was Lieutenant Ronald C. Spears, natural killer, standing in front of me.
Get out there and relieve Dyke and take that attack on in!
I cannot imagine how difficult that must have been for Winters to not retake command of those men with whom he had served for so long and so well. It is a true testament of his strength of character that he quickly realized that his place was not at the front anymore, that instead his job was to delegate that command to someone in whom he could trust. However, just because Winter was no longer physically leading Easy Company into battle does not mean that he could not still lead by example. Let us rewind a bit to before Patton's Third Army broke the German lines, when Easy Company, along with the rest of the 101st Airborne, was surrounded during their defense of Bastogne. That was one of the things I did to set an example for the men. Shave in the morning, and once in a while I would strip to the waist to give myself a French wash. A routine that also caught everyone's attention. I did this for one reason, and one reason only. To get the men's attention, and to let them know that I was going to be around for a while, that this wasn't as bad as they thought it was going to be. Make the best of it. Despite his removal from the command of Easy Company, Winters was still very much living for those men, and for the men in their sister companies. He didn't see the promotion to Battalion XO as the next rung up the ladder, but instead as a different way in which he could serve the soldiers under him. And during the Battle of the Bulge, the paratroopers of the 101st needed competent leadership more than anything. Breaking from Winters a bit, I'm sure he wouldn't mind, I want to briefly mention Breaking Point, my favorite episode in Band of Brothers. This particular episode centers around Easy Company's Sergeant Lipton, who is doing all he can to hold the men together, a difficult task to say the least, due to the oppressive cold, the constant German artillery barrages causing numerous casualties, and the fact that Easy's current CO is most often just not present.
You get things organized here. I'm gonna go for help.
Where's Dyke?
He's around.
Could you be a little more specific there, Sergeant?
Not really, sir.
At the end of the episode, the new commanding officer, Lieutenant Spears, notes how Easy Company had been held together by one man throughout the past weeks, and Lipton has no idea who he's talking about.
Hell, it was you for a sergeant.
Sergeant Lipton wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about the men. It's that simple. That just goes to show that the leadership displayed by Winters was not unique to him. It may have been infectious, and likely the example set by Lipton, Compton, and others were in part due to the excellent quality of their superior officer, but regardless, Easy Company had no shortage of great leaders. I don't think it would be fair to Winters to not at least mention the excellence of the men who had served with him. And it was during the defense of Bastogne that that excellence shone the most. War brings out the worst and the best in people. Wars do not make men great, but they do bring out the greatness in good men. Pause the video and read the rest of that quote if you so desire. It really is worth reading. There's a reason 2 full episodes of Band of Brothers are devoted to Bastogne, despite the duration of Easy Company's action there being a mere 30 days. It was by far the most impactful and demanding campaign of the entire war for those men. Ask any veteran of the campaign in Northwest Europe to identify his single toughest engagement, and you might expect him to say D-Day or some other day when his unit underwent a significant emotional experience. Ask the veteran to identify his toughest campaign, and the choices are less diverse. For a paratrooper in the 101st Airborne Division, the answer is simple: the Battle of the Bulge. In Normandy, I had witnessed lots of stress, some in Holland, but much more at Bastogne due to the cold, lack of sleep, and constant artillery bombardment. I'm not sure that anybody who lived through Bastogne hasn't carried with him in some hidden ways, the scars of fatigue. Perhaps that is a factor that keeps 101st paratroopers bonded so unusually close. It's one of the most remarkable feats of human endurance that any of those men from that division successfully weathered that month in the frozen Belgian landscape, rushed to the front lines short on ammo, food, and clothing, constantly pounded by German artillery and airstrikes, watching their friends and comrades suffer and die. We shouldn't wonder how a man, a great soldier and leader like Lieutenant Compton, should suffer from extreme battle shock and have to be removed from the front lines. Instead, we should marvel that every other paratrooper did not share his fate. Somehow, some way, and surely through the bonds they shared, the men made it through. Principle 10. Hang tough. Never, ever give up. The paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division didn't accomplish any supernatural feats at Bastogne. They simply kept fighting. They held the line, they refused to back down where others had retreated, and thus they demonstrated the pinnacle of human perseverance.
To the German commander. Nuts!
There's a distinct difference between that virtue and its associated vice of stubbornness. Perseverance is rightly ordered, its goal being an objective good. Stubbornness is ordered toward one's own pleasure or satisfaction with little regard for the good of others. Every man in those frozen foxholes was there because his friend was with him, or in the next hole down the line. To be sure, they were also fighting for a greater cause of liberty and self-determination for the people of Europe, but when it came down to it, what kept the men of Easy Company persevering through unimaginable horrors was the determination to not let down their brothers.
I'd really like to head back with the fellas, sir.
Can you make the jump?
Sure, I can't live. I just can't sit.
Wars do not make men great, but they do bring out the greatness in good men. This is what is so special about the stories of Winters and his fellow soldiers. They were, by and large, good men who volunteered for one of the most dangerous roles in the United States military.
So when things got really bad, the man in the foxhole next to them would be the best.
And who strove, despite countless and unspeakable moments of pain, suffering, and loss, to become better men. Not because they thought it would win them awards or a promising career, but because the men beside them needed them to be better. Because, quite simply, it was the right thing to do. 80 years later, the value of the example provided by Major Winters and Easy Company has not faded one bit. What they did in life most certainly echoes into eternity. I will be forever grateful for the privilege of hearing their story. And to finish this video, I will, appropriately, leave you with one final thought from the man himself. Principle 1. Strive to be a leader of character, competence, and courage.